For more insight on that story, we're now joined by historian, political analyst, and author Marcus Papadopoulos, joining us from the British capital, London. We also have author and commentator John Stepling, who's with us from Inderøy, Norway. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Papadopoulos in London. And I'd like to get, first of all, your perspective on the recent comments made by the Russian President Vladimir Putin.
The most pivotal lesson stemming from the ongoing economic war between the West and the Russian Federation is that Russia cannot be excluded and isolated on the international stage by any power, including by the United States of America. Now, you may ask why that is. Well, casting aside the not so small detail that the Russian Federation is both a military and nuclear superpower, Russia covers 1/6 of the world's land surface, and the total value of Russian natural resources is in excess of $75 trillion. Accordingly, the Russian economy is essentially a commodities-based one, though Russia's defense export sector is also enormous and second only to the American one. But as I said, the Russian economy is largely speaking a commodities-based one. The Russian economy offers commodities to people in all four corners of the world, which are absolutely imperative to their existence. I'm not just referring to gas and oil, but I'm also referring to foodstuffs, I'm referring to chemicals, I am referring to fertilizers, and I am referring also to building materials such as cement. Therefore, the day that the West's ruling elites decided to embark on an economic war against the Russian economy was quite simply a death sentence for the ordinary man and woman in the West. Not a death sentence, of course, for the Western ruling elites, because they are millionaires, or if they are not millionaires, they are multi-millionaires. If they are not multi-millionaires, they are billionaires. If they are not billionaires, they are multi-billionaires. But as I said, taking on Russia in an economic fight was always going to be immensely harmful to the ordinary man and woman in the West. And the consequences of that are as such that an impending economic catastrophe is about to strike Britain and the rest of Europe. And even though time is still on Europe's side to avert this catastrophe, if that catastrophe is not averted, then I believe that what Europe will witness in peacetime, that is, will be unprecedented, because tens of millions of Europeans, including Britons, face the possibility of falling into poverty, of becoming homeless, of losing their jobs, and also of dying because of exposure to the cold elements, because they will not be able to afford to put their central heating system on. So again, the story, the lesson from the economic war between the West and Russia is that Russia cannot be excluded and isolated in the world by any power.
John Stepling, Putin said that Russia is facing economic, financial, and technological aggression from the West, but the economic situation has stabilized in general. Give us your perspective on the recent comments made by Putin, and do you believe that the Western stance, specifically Europe's stance against Russia with regards to the Ukraine conflict, has backfired on them?
Well, I think Putin's speech was remarkably articulate, actually, and he was basically correct, and what Marcus just said is basically correct as well. But you have to put this in some sort of perspective historically. With the fall of the Soviet Union, that's when the U.S. began to target Russia and as they targeted the rest of the world. If you go back to the early 90s, you have Iraq, you have later the dismantling of Yugoslavia, then you have 2001, the pivot to Africa, Afghanistan. Anybody who exhibited any kind of independence had to be eliminated. Gaddafi is a perfect example. The pivot to Africa meant the US increased its military footprint there. They built more bases, they protected Western mining rights. And then they began to move eastward. They have encircled China militarily, but they are relatively impotent in terms of an economic war with China. China's far more economically powerful than the U.S. now. And then Russia, and the plan was to overextend and cripple and weaken Russia, to eventually enact some kind of coup d'etat, what they call regime change. There was a Rand paper, policy paper that outlined this exactly, and the authors of that are in the Biden administration. The 2014 coup was orchestrated by the West. They have picked the people to put in power in Ukraine. And when the Pandora Papers were released in 2021, they mentioned Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe by a wide margin. They never even mentioned Putin or Russia. The United States knew this. They don't care about that. It was estimated by a CBS report, a Western news media organization. They admitted that only 30% of the weapons and aid getting to Ukraine make it to the battlefield. The rest go to private individuals, cartels, mafias, etc. But the United States doesn't care. They are forging ahead with this. It's part of a global plan. I mean, we see all of the policies in Europe now, the Netherlands destroying its agricultural sector. We saw what happened during the pandemic, the sort of retail apocalypse, as somebody described it, further consolidation, the transference of wealth continued to the top 1 or 2% over the last 10 years. It reached, extraordinary proportions during the pandemic. Everybody can see that the lockdowns and so forth were extraordinary overreach, were ridiculous, they were political choices. And so the result has been to stave off a sort of collapse of capitalism in the West, certainly in the United States, but they are barely holding on. I mean, you just have to travel to any American city to look at the levels of homelessness and suffering. Despair in the American population. It has fueled the rise of a far right-wing populism in the U.S., which may be overstated. But people are without jobs, without hope, and winter is coming. In cold parts of the country, it's going to be terrible. In Europe, the same thing. The governments are following a blueprint that I think intentionally means to pauperize the working class. They will institute some sort of universal basic income which will further pauperize the working class. And that's all intentional. The proxy war against Ukraine has backfired. Russia has essentially won this war. The US will continue to feed Ukraine with aid and weapons, but it's not going to change the outcome. So, yeah, I mean, Putin's right. You can't exclude Russia. Russia has enormous leverage, enormous resources, and the U.S. is a desperate nation right now, a failing hegemon.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. Author and commentator John Stepling joining us from Indora, Norway, and historian, political analyst, and author Marcus Papadopoulos speaking to us from the British capital, London.